Now, a lot of it has to do with the Cold War and the threat of communism. Early in his administration in March, they were faced with a crisis in Southeast Asia. Not necessarily in Vietnam. As I'll point out later, there's a war going on here, but it's not a crisis by any means yet. The real crisis is actually in Laos. That's where there's a communist insurgency. And Kennedy, early in his administration, is actively working, trying to at least neutralize that country. But Southeast Asia will crop up again very soon in his administration. The bigger problem, and the one that's on the front burner when he takes office, is Cuba. In the late 1950s, Fidel Castro overthrew the then dictator of Cuba, American-backed dictator, Batista, and established his own dictatorship. Tensions between Castro and the United States soon frayed. The more Castro moved to the left, the less the United States wanted to do with him. And the Eisenhower administration eventually severed diplomatic ties. Eisenhower also authorized a CIA plot to overthrow Castro. It would involve Cuban nationals, counter-revolutionaries, that would be armed and trained and aided by the United States. And the CIA gave it the code name Operation Zapata. Any of you folks speak Spanish? Zapata?
Shoe.
Way to go, thank you. It's Operation Shoe. Good morning. Now, when Kennedy became president, he's briefed on Operation Zapata. And the CIA director happens to be Allen Dulles, the brother of Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. Kennedy okays the plan, but with one major restriction: no direct American involvement. We'll train them, we'll arm them, but we won't get directly involved. No American air power. Dulles signed off on that, but failed to tell the counter-revolutionaries. Now, as much as the CIA tried to keep it a secret, they couldn't. Long before the invasion, Castro already knew about it. Had a lot to do with the director of the CIA, Allen Dulles. For being a professional spy, he had a bad habit of shooting his mouth off. He was somewhat of a womanizer, liked to go to parties in New York, cocktail parties and things like that, and brag about what the agency was up to. So Castro knew about the invasion. So on the 17th of April, 1961, 1,500 counter-revolutionaries land at an isolated beach in Cuba known as the Bahia de Cochinos. Sounds much better in Spanish than it does in English. What's Bahia de Cochinos? What's that in English? The Bay of Pigs. Told you it sounded much better in English. Castro's forces are waiting for him. the anticipated American air support, which Kennedy, good morning, which Kennedy had declined, never shows up, and most of the counter-revolutionaries are captured. Even though Kennedy had not originated the plan or authorized any use of American air power in it, he's president. And as president, you take the blame for it. So for a relatively new president, he'd only been in office a few months, this is a major embarrassment. It also scares the hell out of Castro, who believes the United States wants to invade Cuba. He wasn't too far off on that. Here are some of the US-backed rebels being led off to prison camp. The Kennedy administration will eventually ransom most of them back from Cuba. It costs the US government several $1 million. And here's a cartoon at the time of the Bay of Pigs disaster. The exploding cigar is a reference to the fact Kennedy was known to like Cuban cigars. Now, Kennedy is further embarrassed when he meets Premier Khrushchev of the Soviet Union for a major summit in Vienna on the 4th of June, 1961. Kennedy had hoped to sit down and basically talk one-on-one with Khrushchev and resolve some of the outstanding issues. But remember, this isn't that long after the U-2 incident. And Khrushchev is still steaming about that. He had put his credibility on the line, saying we can trust Eisenhower, and then the U-2 incident happened. So Khrushchev was in no mood to be congenial. And keep in mind, he's an older gentleman, he's in his 60s. Kennedy, by comparison, is young. Instead of a meeting of minds at Vienna, Khrushchev pretty much dresses Kennedy down, talks down to him, dictates to him. It's a bit of a shock to Kennedy. It's also a test. Now, Kennedy's going to rise to the occasion. On the 13th of August, 1961, the West was shocked when they woke up that morning to find out that overnight, the Russians and the East Germans had began constructing a wall between East and West Berlin. They figured out if we can't keep the West out of Berlin, we can keep the East Berliners from going to the West. East Berlin slowly closed off from 80 exits to 12 exits to 7, and then none. It looked like a prelude to another Berlin crisis. You know, the Berlin airlift. Well, good morning. What do you do if you're Kennedy? The Russians haven't attacked the West. But this is certainly a provocative move. He'll go to Berlin and address the good people of Berlin. And he gives them assurances the United States will never abandon them. He says, "Ich bin ein Berliner," which in proper German means I too am a Berliner. But there's always a problem when presidents try and speak another language. By the way, Kennedy spoke German, but he didn't speak German slang, and that's where the problem came in. A Berliner is a nickname in Germany for a jelly donut. So Kennedy, in his rousing speech, told the people of Berlin, I too am a jelly donut. Could be worse. Huh? No, they didn't shoot him over that. Could be worse. President Ford, when he was visiting Poland, on a very historic state visit, of course, he didn't speak any Polish. The interpreter who interpreted his speech, he was supposed to say, I have tremendous respect for the Polish people. And the interpreter screwed it up, and it came out, I lust after the Polish people. That didn't wake up at all, huh? Hey, the Poles got a kick out of it, yeah. And the Berliners got a kick out of the Ich bin ein Berliner. And here's the building of the wall in August of 1961. And here's the Berlin Wall when it was finished. And here's Kennedy's speech. I'll bring it up, forgot to bring it in. I've got a chunk of the Berlin Wall. When it came down, one of my former colleagues here happened to be visiting in Germany. And they got a whole section of it about that big. And they were nice enough to give me a piece of it. All it is a piece of concrete. Makes a good paperweight. The speech in Berlin shows Kennedy's idealism, and he expressed that in many ways. One was the creation of the Peace Corps. He first had announced it during the 1960 presidential campaign. And on March 1st, 1961, by executive order, he creates the Peace Corps. Congress will later vote a bill and make it official. It's basically young Americans going to developing countries and lending their expertise. But what differs the Peace Corps from previous American volunteers, aside from the fact they tend to be young, a lot of them are college or just out of college, mostly your age or a little older, but they don't go and help the people from 9 to 5 and then go back to a Hilton and stay there that night. They actually live in the village they're working with. They live under the same conditions of the people. They eat the same food. They're basically on the same level with everybody. This goes a long way to promote a positive image of the United States. Because of the post-war affluence in the United States, Americans were traveling more and more in the 60s, 50s and 60s. You see the advent of jet travel as well, so it's a lot shorter. Well, the image of the so-called ugly American develops. Crass, uneducated, pockets full of money though, obnoxious, sort of the unfortunate image a lot of Japanese tourists gained in the 80s and 90s. The Peace Corps did a lot to dispel the image of the ugly American. It showed a very caring and concerned American. In August of 61, the first group of volunteers leave for Ghana and Tanzania in Africa. There's about 3,000 volunteers working outside the United States in 1961. By 62, there are 7,300 Peace Corps volunteers in 44 countries, excuse me. And by 1966, there are over 15,000 volunteers working around the world. Apparently, it's a very rewarding experience. It's still around. I had a colleague years ago when I taught at NKU, Dr. John Metz. He's one of the geographers. He had spent time in the Peace Corps. It was a very rewarding experience for him, even if he almost got lynched. He got sent to Tibet, got off the airplane, got grabbed by a mob, and they were about to lynch him. And then another American came up and explained to him that he wasn't the guy they were looking for. Some idiot had robbed a Buddhist temple that morning, and it fit John's description. And the crowd was so angry when they saw him, they thought he was responsible. So how would you like that for your first day on the job? Almost get lynched by the locals. He said after that, they were great. He loved every minute of it. But that first day was just a little harrowing. And here's Kennedy signing the Peace Corps Act. Somewhere on here. By the way, notice all pens in front of me. Whenever a president signs a bill, they use multiple pens. Sometimes, depending on the historic nature of the bill, they might use a different pen to sign each letter. Then the pens are handed out to supporters of that bill or people that had, lobbied for it, souvenirs. And here are some of the young Peace Corps volunteers. Another area Kennedy's idealism is going to shine is in the space race. Now, if you remember, the Russians launched the first artificial satellite in October of 1957, Sputnik. And we responded several months later with Explorer 1. From that point on, the so-called space race was going on. The Russians put the first dog into space. So we have to put a dog into space. They put a monkey in space. We put a chimpanzee into space. That'll show them. The difference is, by the way, ours come back alive. Yeah, the Russians, when they shot the dog was known as Latka. When they shot the poor dog up into space, they made a lot of capital out of it. They had a camera in there and they showed the dog in space. They didn't tell anybody it had a limited air supply and no way to get back. So the poor dog died up in space. We at least brought everything back. And on the 12th of April, 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin becomes the first man to go into space and safely return. Much of the Russian space program was secret. They only announced things after they had accomplished them. Ours were on TV. You could watch them. We screwed up in front of the world. But the Russians were rather secretive. So, according to at least American intelligence estimates, Gagarin wasn't the first man into space. He was just the first one to come back alive in one piece. Apparently, the Russians had already sent 2 different cosmonauts up into space, and one had blown up on the way up there, and the other one blew up or crash landed when he came back and died. So Gagarin was the first one to come back and live. Eisenhower really saw no reason to match the Russians on this. He saw space flight as expensive, dangerous, and didn't see much value in it. But Kennedy did. And one of the things he did when he took over the presidency was revive the space program. Put Vice President Lyndon Johnson in charge of it. And not coincidentally, that's why NASA headquarters ended up in Houston, LBJ's home state. What a coincidence. Nope. On the 5th of May, 1961, less than a month after Gagarin, astronaut Alan B. Shepard became the first American into space. It was Project Mercury. His capsule was Freedom 7. His flight lasted a whopping 15 minutes and 28 seconds. He basically went up and then came back down. The flight may have been under 16 minutes, but he was supposed to launch that morning at dawn, and they had trouble with the spacecraft. That was typical. They often had to postpone launches for a few hours. Well, they had planned on a less than half-hour flight. There were no provisions in his spacesuit if the guy had to go to the bathroom. And he's sitting on the launch pad for hours that morning, and he had a big breakfast, coffee, eggs, food, things like that. And he had to go to the bathroom, or he had to pee really bad. And they had to consult the engineers and finally determined if he went in the suit, it wouldn't damage anything. So after that, NASA always made sure they built bathroom facilities into the spacesuits. Something you don't see on TV when they show the space flight. And on the 20th of February, 1962, John Glenn, here from Ohio, became the first American to orbit the planet. And he almost died too. His heat shield buckled in the front of the space capsule, and if that thing would have come off, he would have burned up on re-entry. If you were a kid back then, I was growing up in this era, you were fascinated with the space race, and the astronauts were your heroes. I always grew up idolizing people like John Glenn and the other astronauts. Gave us, some genuine heroes to look up to. So I always have a soft spot in my heart for the astronauts. Here's the first man to return safely from space, Yuri Gagarin. Over the years, he worked a lot with different American astronauts, and the general consensus was he was a great guy. They all liked him. They considered him very courageous. He was friendly, outgoing. He was no Russian ideologue by any means. He was kind of an engineer just like they were. So the Russian cosmonauts and the American astronauts got along much better than their countries did. It was a shared brotherhood. And here's Alan Shepard. And here's President Kennedy inspecting Friendship 7. That's John Glenn looking over his shoulder. Any of you folks ever seen any of these space capsules? From the Mercury program, or your Apollo? Yeah.
And one, there's a capsule in Brett Patterson.
Yeah, I think there's Mercury one of the Apollos. Yeah. Yeah. Those things are rather small, aren't they? Kind of cramped. Yeah.
It's like a 2-seater model,
It's a good way to describe it, yeah.
On the wire.
Not much room. Well, we've now circled the Earth. What's next? Well, the 25th of May, 1961, before a joint session of Congress, Kennedy announced the goal of putting a man on the moon before the end of the decade. As Kennedy told them, we chose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. It was a hell of a challenge. They loved it at NASA. What becomes the Apollo space program had been planned as early as 1960, but Eisenhower didn't want anything to do with it. Here's Kennedy now saying, we will land on the moon before the decade's out. So while the engineers are thrilled, they still have to invent much of the technology to get us there. When Kennedy made his promise, we didn't have the technical information, the capability we needed to actually pull this off. And one of the great miracles of the 1960s was going to be the development of the space program and the technology that goes along with it. And ironically, for all the expense of the space program, people say, why did we spend that money? We just brought a bunch of rocks back. In developing the program, they learned so much scientifically in engineering, technology, medicine, food preparation, you name it. In 100 different fields, the space program has paid dividends 1,000 times over. But still, it was a daunting challenge. And we would eventually pull it off. Now, as I mentioned, Castro was alarmed by the Bay of Pigs. And he was afraid of American invasion. He requested Soviet troops to be stationed in Cuba as a hedge against the Americans. Now, Khrushchev didn't want to send Red Army troops to Cuba for internal political reasons. Unlike in the United States, the Red Army, the Russian army, is a political force. They have a strong hand in Russian politics. And Khrushchev was increasingly butting heads with them. He wanted to kind of undercut them, undermine them. So instead of sending Russian troops to Cuba, which he didn't think he could control, he decided to send missiles. The Soviet missile force, their so-called strategic rocket force, is actually a separate branch of their military. Was not controlled by the Red Army. Who controls our ballistic missiles? Which branch of the armed forces controls the ICBMs? Huh? I'm sorry?
The branch of the armed forces control the armed forces of the whole government.
No, one branch of the military controls the ICBMs. Thank you. Yeah, the US Air Force. The Navy has ship launch or submarine launch ones too. But it's largely the Air Force in this country. So Khrushchev said he would put medium-range atomic missiles in Cuba. And that would solve several of his problems. One, it would shut Castro up, hopefully. Secondly, it would undercut the Red Army. He wouldn't have to rely on them. Third, it would give him an advantage over the United States. Cuba's only 90 miles off our coast. The Russian SS-4 missiles that they plan to install, its maximum range, those missiles could just hit Cincinnati. Lucky for us, we were just right in the circle. Now, on the 14th of October, 1962, U-2 overflights of Cuba confirmed the Russians were installing the missiles. We had spies in Cuba that told us about them, but they didn't have any physical evidence. And before we could confront the Russians, we needed some kind of evidence to present. So Kennedy learns about the missiles. What does he do about it? Now, he calls a meeting of his key advisors, all 14 of them. And by the way, before that, he called both previous presidents, Truman and Eisenhower, and briefed them on it. That's usually typical among presidential administrations. If you have a crisis, you first call the previous presidents and let them know confidentially. Anyway, Kennedy's options appeared limited. He could do nothing. He could ignore them. He could try and negotiate with the Russians. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, his Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, and his Chief Military Advisor, General Maxwell Taylor, all suggested an attack and invasion of Cuba. Take out the missile sites before they're operable. Now, this could precipitate a third world war. So luckily, his advisors came up with another option. His brother Robert Kennedy, who was serving as Attorney General, and the Undersecretary of State, George Ball, who was extremely influential in Kennedy administration and later the Johnson administration, gave Kennedy yet another alternative. Put a blockade on Cuba. Prevent the Russians from sending in any more parts or missiles. The sites aren't finished yet. If we do that, that will compel the Russians to make the next move. So Kennedy decided on the so-called blockade. Here's a range of those missiles, the SS-4s. Oh, wait a minute, here's a map of them. This is a declassified CIA map, courtesy of the Kennedy Library. But the Russian SS-4s, the medium-range missiles they were putting in Cuba, could barely hit targets on the outer rim of the circle. And here's Cincinnati, just right here, right in the middle. Looks like if we were in Dayton, we'd be okay. On the 22nd of October, 1962, which was a Monday, great way to start a work week. On a special announcement at 7 p.m. that night, and actually remember, I was old enough to remember Kennedy going on television and making this announcement. Yes, I'm ancient. But Kennedy informed the nation of the missiles and said he was putting a, quote, naval quarantine on Cuba. So why does he call it a quarantine instead of a blockade? It's more than just semantics. Remember the Spanish-American War? What did I say about blockades back then? Remember, this is our second blockade of Cuba, too. Under international law, they're considered an act of war. So if we call this a blockade, we're in essence declaring war on Cuba. By calling it a quarantine, we evade that. And it's not a strict blockade. The American Navy surrounds the island, and they check the ships going in and out, but they don't stop anything that doesn't contain the contraband. If it's food, if it's fuel, if it's furniture from IKEA, whatever, they let it go through. Most of the ships aren't even stopped. The Navy radios the ship, asks to see their manifest, they radio the manifest over. If there's nothing suspicious in it, the ships go on their way. So it's not a pure blockade, but there's nothing the Russians can do about it. The Russian Navy is tiny compared to the US Navy back then. And on top of that, a Russian tanker, the Bucharest, actually stops and allows the Americans to board her and check her manifest. And when it's found out she's carrying fuel, they let it go. But by doing that, it's tacit admission by the Russians that this is a legal quarantine. By the way, it was stopped, one of the other ships that was stopped, the Russian freighter, was stopped by the destroyer Joseph P. Kennedy, named after the president's brother. This was sheer coincidence. The president had nothing to do with the ships assigned to the quarantine, and the destroyer just happened to be assigned to the Atlantic Fleet, so it was assigned to the quarantine. But a lot of people thought Kennedy had purposely ordered the ship there, for the publicity. But he didn't. He didn't even know it was there until the news broke. Now, if the blockade doesn't work by the 29th, it was another Monday, they were planning an invasion of Cuba. Now, the U.S. government, Kennedy's in particular, showed a knack for diplomacy. Kennedy knew that Khrushchev was in a spot, and he had to find some way to allow Khrushchev to back down and still save face. We had really embarrassed the Russians over this. Adlai Stevenson, the guy that had ran twice unsuccessfully against Eisenhower for the presidency, was now our ambassador to the United Nations. And at the UN, he challenged the Russians to admit the missiles were in Cuba. And the Russians prevaricated with a straight answer. And Stephen challenged them in front of the entire United Nations, told the Russian ambassador, he goes, I'm willing to wait till hell freezes over for your answer. And finally, the Soviet ambassador, Valerian Zollin, finally said yes, or finally said no, we don't have any missiles in Cuba. And right at that point, Stevenson signaled to some aides, and they wheeled out the really big, blown up CIA pictures of the missiles in Cuba, pointing out that Zorin and the Russians were bald-faced liars. It was a huge diplomatic coup for the United States. And after this, we could have reduced Cuba to a parking lot and the world wouldn't have said a word. It was also one of Stevenson's finest moments. Here's a U-2 photograph of the various missile sites in Cuba. These happen to be at San Cristobal. The U-2 aircraft that we had used over Russia now had a camera that was capable of photographing a golf ball from 55,000 feet. So we could easily photograph and determine what those things were. And to show you a little bit about presidential confidentiality, this is Kennedy's itinerary, the morning anyway, of Tuesday, October 16th, when he was told about the missiles. One, it shows you how busy a president can be. But here's the meeting that counted. Off the record meeting, re-Cuba. And notice it's only listed for 7 minutes. That's the official report. Didn't work out that way. The deadline was approaching. Kennedy sent word to the Soviet ambassador, through Robert Kennedy, and a reporter, John Scally. Scally had long covered the so-called Russian beat in Washington, and he was a good friend of Valery Zorin and the other Russian officials. They could trust him. He became the American intermediary with the Russians. And over the weekend, they brokered a deal. The Russians will take their missiles out of Cuba. That makes us happy. We publicly pledge not to invade Cuba. That reassures Castro. And by the way, Kennedy had no plans to invade Cuba anyway. So this was like a freebie. He was giving away something he never planned to do in the first place. And what does Khrushchev get out of this? Sort of like the Wizard of Oz. No, he doesn't get a brain or a heart. Definitely doesn't get the heart. But he does get something he can take back to other communist leaders, make it look like a victory. When Kennedy first took office, he had ordered the Air Force to remove 4 ICBM missiles from Turkey and Italy. The missiles were obsolete, They were liquid fueled, and the fuel itself was highly explosive. And the Turkish and Italian governments were never comfortable with these missiles on their territory. They're afraid the damn thing would blow up in its silo, set off the warhead, and boom, you got a nuclear catastrophe. So Kennedy had ordered the Air Force to dismantle the missiles when he first took office. But the Air Force had dragged its feet. They were basically holding them for bargaining chips. They wanted a new generation of missiles that would be stationed here in the United States. So they hadn't dismantled these obsolete Thor missiles yet. Kennedy agreed to get rid of them. So Khrushchev could go back to the other leaders in the Soviet Union and say, the Americans have agreed to get rid of those missiles in exchange for the ones in Cuba. And again, it was something we were trying to do in the first place. But at least everybody comes out of this happy, and everybody comes out of it with something to show for it. That's the art of diplomacy, folks. So on that Saturday, 27th of October, the same day, a U-2 plane is shot down over Cuba, and the pilot unfortunately killed. That evening, the Russians accept the deal. The crisis had lasted 13 days and brought the world closer to nuclear warfare than it's ever been. This is the only known incident in American history where the armed forces actually went to DEFCON 2. You know what that means? The DEFCONs were different alert statuses. Basically, it's for defense, emergency, something I can't remember. Normally, we're at DEFCON 3. That means everything's okay, there's no immediate danger. DEFCON 2 means that war is imminent. And if you ever go to DEFCON 1, what does that mean? Huh? Yes, it means war. So we were one step away from nuclear war. Now, a lot of good will come out of this. Both sides had seen the precipice, had looked down, didn't like what they saw. They both realized that we had been toying with disaster. So after this, you're going to see a relative thaw in American-Soviet relations again. On one hand, the Russians will also learn the danger of trying to fight a proxy war through a surrogate state like Cuba. Fortunately, we don't learn that lesson with Vietnam. So both sides from this point on will exhibit more caution and shift towards negotiations. For the first time, a secure telephone line is set up between the Kremlin and Washington, D.C. It's nicknamed the hotline. By the way, it doesn't mean the president can pick it up and get the Soviet premier on the phone within a minute. Not like carrying around your cell phone. It goes through a series of scrambling banks, computer banks, and all that first. And usually you contact an aide and they would let the other side know and all that. But it does mean the President of the United States can get basically in contact with the Russian premier within about a half hour. And over the years, having that quote hotline has helped prevent a lot of crises from boiling over. One of the smartest things they did, and all it was basically was a phone bank. And on the 25th of July, 1963, both sides signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. The first real attempt to put the genie back in the bottle. Both sides agreed to halt above ground testing. The United States, between 1945 and 1963, had set off well over 1,000 nukes here in the United States and in the Pacific. The Russians had set off about the same number. The environmental consequences of this are catastrophic. To begin with, when you look at a lot of the test sites in Nevada and New Mexico, the towns around them, even for 50, 100 miles away, you see a huge spike in the incidence of certain cancers caused by these. I mean, you used to be able to watch the blast from Las Vegas. But then again, the winds would shift, and they bring all that nuclear debris right onto the good citizens of Las Vegas, for example. Plus, nuclear testing around the world has led to the fact that all the milk you drink today, doesn't matter where it comes from, there are traces of strontium-90. It's a direct result of the nuclear testing. It's only a small amount, but nowhere have I ever heard there's a government recommendation for strontium-90. It's a radioactive element. So the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty does a lot, first, to put the genie back in the bottle. If you can't test above ground, it slows new development. We can still test underground, but you don't get sometimes the same results. Slows things up. And secondly, as I pointed out, it's good for the environment. Now, Kennedy is going to face some domestic challenges. And as we shall see in a lecture or two, a great challenge in Southeast Asia and Vietnam. But on Friday, I want to shift and talk a little bit about domestic matters. In particular, the civil rights movement. And I'll see you guys on Friday.